The Mozambican Civil War began in 1977, 2 years after the end of the War of Independence. It resembled the Angolan Civil War in that both were proxy wars of the Cold War that started soon after the countries gained independence from Portugal. The ruling party, Front for Liberation of Mozambique, and the National Armed Forces of Mozambique, were violently opposed from 1977 by the Mozambique resistance movement, which received funding from white-ruled Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa. About 1 million people died in fighting and from starvation, 5 million civilians were displaced, and many were made amputees by landmines, a legacy from the war that plagued Mozambique for more than 2 decades afterward. Fighting ended in 1992 and the country's first multi-party elections were held in 1994. Outset. Independence. In the 1950s and 1960s, Mozambican resistance to Portuguese colonial rule intensified, with gathering resentment of Portuguese authorities for centuries of exploitation, oppression and neglect. After a successful wave of independence movements in other African territories, Cold War powers and the international community started to urge Portugal to leave its territories in Africa. Sentiment for Mozambique's own national independence developed, and on 25 June 1962 several Mozambican anti-Portuguese political groups formed the Mozambique Liberation Front in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. FRELIMO's first president was Eduardo Mondlane, whose first objective was to forge a broad-based insurgent coalition that could effectively challenge the colonial regime. Anonymous private contributors, many of them friends of Mondlane, financed or secured money for FRELIMO's health, publicity, and educational projects, while military equipment and training came from Algeria, the Soviet Union and China. On 25 September 1964, FRELIMO soldiers, with logistical assistance from the surrounding population, attacked the administrative post at Chai in the province of Cabo Delgado. This raid marked the beginning of the armed struggle against the Portuguese colonial government. FRELIMO militants were able to evade pursuit and surveillance by employing guerrilla tactics, ambushing patrols, sabotaging communication and railroad lines, and making hit-and-run attacks against colonial outposts before rapidly fading into accessible backwater areas. At the war's outset, FRELIMO had little hope for a military victory. Its hope lay in a war of attrition to compel a negotiated independence from Lisbon. Portugal fought its own version of protracted warfare. Had the military succeeded with a minimum of expenditure and casualties, the war could have remained undecided for much longer. In the early 1970s, Operation Gordian Knot and the following Portuguese campaigns were militarily successful in destroying guerrilla forces and support bases in the territory. But the expense in blood and national wealth was more costly for Lisbon than military defeat. The Portuguese army was never destroyed on the battlefield, although amid plummeting morale some of its officers were converted to FRELIMO's communist ideology and hoped to bring it home to Portugal. On 25 April 1974, the authoritarian regime of Estado Novo had been overthrown in Lisbon, a move that was supported by many Portuguese workers and peasants. The armed forces movement in Portugal pledged a return to civil liberties and an end to the fighting in all colonies. The rapid chain of events within Portugal caught FRELIMO, which had anticipated a protracted guerrilla campaign, by surprise. It responded quickly to the new situation, and on 7 September 1974 won an agreement from the armed forces movement to transfer power to FRELIMO within a year. When this was made known to the public, several thousand Portuguese colonials fled the newly independent country. As a result of the exodus, the economy and social organization of Mozambique collapsed. On 25 June 1975, Mozambique gained independence from Portugal, with Samora Machel as the head of state. Geopolitical situation. The independence of Mozambique and Angola in 1975 challenged white minority rule in southern Africa. First, the independence wars in Angola and Mozambique demonstrated that even with great military resources it was virtually impossible for a small white minority to guarantee the safety of its members, let alone to exert control over a hostile black population outside of major power centers. The downfall of Portuguese rule gave hope to black resistance in South Africa and Rhodesia. Second, in both countries revolutionary socialist movements gained power. These movements had been cooperating with the black resistance movements in South Africa and Rhodesia, and now openly supported them, as well as offering them a safe haven from where they could coordinate their operations and train new forces. As Samora Machel put it in a speech in 1975, "The struggle in Zimbabwe is our struggle." This was especially devastating for white-ruled Rhodesia, whose armed forces lacked the manpower to effectively protect its 800-mile border with Mozambique against entering insurgents. At the same time, the apartheid government and the Smith regime lost Portugal as an ally, and with it the tens of thousands of soldiers that had been deployed in the Portuguese colonial wars. Thus, South Africa's and Rhodesia's white minorities' position were severely weakened by the events of 1974–75. Subsequently, undermining the newly independent country's capacity to support their neighboring brothers in arms became South Africa's and Rhodesia's main strategy to counter this new threat. This manifested itself in the Rhodesia-sponsored foundation of RENAMO in 1975 and in South Africa's adoption of the Total National Strategy. Internal Mozambican tensions. FRELIMO dissidents. Soon after independence, FRELIMO announced Mozambique's transformation into a socialist one-party state. This was accompanied by crackdowns on dissidents and the nationalization of important branches. The leaders of the PCN, a new party in favor of multi-party governance founded by prominent FRELIMO dissidents, were arrested and convicted in show trials. They were later extrajudicially executed. Furthermore, nationalization of many Portuguese-owned enterprises, fear of retaliation among whites, and an ultimatum to either choose Mozambican citizenship or leave the country within 90 days, drove the majority of the 370,000 white Portuguese Mozambicans out of the country. This resulted in economic collapse and chaos, as only few Africans had received higher education or even primary education under Portuguese rule. Overturning of traditional hierarchies and re-education camps. As a revolutionary Marxist party, FRELIMO embarked on overturning traditional governance structures in order to gain full control over every aspect of society. Therefore, local chiefs were ousted and thousands of dissidents were imprisoned in so-called re-education camps. Another source of conflict was the continuation of the aldeamento system that the Portuguese had introduced as a means of exerting control and inhibiting contact between the population and the rebels. It forced the rural populace to move into central communal villages, the aldeamentos. FRELIMO hoped that this system would enable the fulfillment of its agricultural development goals, but its implementation alienated the rural population. This was especially the case in central and northern Mozambique, where households are traditionally separated by considerable distances. Course of the war. Outbreak. From 1976 to 1977, Rhodesian troops repeatedly entered Mozambique in order to carry out operations against ZANLA bases tolerated on Mozambican territory by the FRELIMO government. During one such raid, Rhodesian forces freed FRELIMO ex-official Andre Matsangesa from a re-education camp. He was given military training and installed as leader of RENAMO, which had been founded by the Rhodesian Secret Service shortly before. It was created in Salisbury, Rhodesia under the auspices of Ken Flower, head of the Rhodesian CIO, and Orlando Cristina, an ex-Portuguese, secret police operative with long experience in Africa. RENAMO subsequently started operating in the Gorongosa area in order to fight FRELIMO and ZANLA. However, in 1979 Matsang Essa died in RENAMO's unsuccessful first attack on a regional center and RENAMO was ousted from the area. Subsequently, Afonso Dhlakama became the new leader of RENAMO and formed it into an effective guerrilla army. RENAMO strategies and operations. Having fought the Portuguese using guerrilla strategies, FRELIMO was now forced to defend itself against the very same methods. It had to defend vast areas and hundreds of locations, while RENAMO operated out of a few remote areas, carrying out raids against towns and important infrastructure. Furthermore, RENAMO systematically forced civilians into its employment. This was done by mass abduction, especially of children, in order to use them as soldiers. It is estimated that one-third of RENAMO forces were child soldiers. But abducted people also had to serve RENAMO in administrative or public service functions in the areas it controlled. Another way of using civilians for military purposes was the so-called system of Gandhi Era. This system especially affected the rural population in areas controlled by RENAMO, forcing them to fulfill three main tasks. 1. Produce food for RENAMO. 2. Transport goods and ammunition. 3. In the case of women, serve as sex slaves. Both sides heavily relied on the use of landmines, FRELIMO as a means to defend important infrastructure, RENAMO in order to terrify the populace, stall the economy and destroy the civil services, mining roads, schools and health centers. Thus, despite its far superior numbers, FRELIMO was unable to adequately defend any but the most important cities. By the mid-1980s, FRELIMO had lost control of much of the countryside. RENAMO was able to carry out raids virtually anywhere in the country except for the major cities. Transportation had become a perilous business. Even armed convoys were not safe from RENAMO attacks. FRELIMO strategies and operations. FRELIMO reacted by reusing a system first introduced by the Portuguese. The creation of fortified communal villages called aldeamentos where much of the rural population was relocated. Furthermore, in order to keep a minimum level of infrastructure working, 3 heavily guarded and mined corridors were established consisting of roads, railways and power lines. The Beira, the Tete and the Limpopo corridors. Foreign support and intervention. FRELIMO initially received substantial military and development aid from the Soviet Union and later additionally, from France, the UK and the US. In the US, conservative circles lobbied for the support of RENAMO but were opposed by the State Department, which finally gained the upper hand following reports which documented RENAMO's brutality. RENAMO received military support from Rhodesia, South Africa, and Kenya as well as organizational support from Western Germany. Hastings Banda, the president of Malawi, backed both FRELIMO and RENAMO. He used the Malawi Young Pioneers to back RENAMO whilst his country's armed forces backed the FRELIMO government in order to defend Malawian interests in Mozambique. In 1982, landlocked Zimbabwe directly intervened in the Civil War in order to secure its transport ways. stop cross-border RENAMO raids and help its old ally FRELIMO. Zimbabwe's help was crucial to the defense of the corridors. Later Zimbabwe became engaged further, carrying out several joint operations with FRELIMO against RENAMO strongholds. Thus RENAMO had to give up its base camps in the Goronoza area. Tanzania also sent troops to back FRELIMO. After the fall of the Ian Smith government in Rhodesia, South Africa became RENAMO's main supporter. Malawi was used as a conduit for South African aid to reach RENAMO. The FRELIMO administration, led by President Machel, was economically ruined by the Civil War. The military and diplomatic contact with the Soviet Union could not alleviate the nation's economic misery and famine. As a result, a reluctant President Machel signed a non-aggression pact with South Africa, known as the Gumati Accord. In return, Pretoria promised to sever economic assistance in exchange for FRELIMO's commitment to prevent the ANC from using Mozambique as a sanctuary to pursue its campaign to overthrow white minority rule in South Africa. Following a May 1983 car bombing in Pretoria, South African troops attacked suspected ANC bases in Maputo. In October, they raided the capital a second time, attacking an office building said to have been used by the organization. With the economy in shambles, Machel was forced to scale back some socialist policies. In a visit to Western Europe that same month, agreed to military and economic pacts with Portugal, France, and the UK. He also abandoned the idea of collectivized agriculture, a result of which the Soviet Union terminated all aid to Mozambique. The volume of direct South African government support for RENAMO diminished after the Gumati Accord, but documents discovered during the capture of RENAMO headquarters at Goronoza in central Mozambique in August 1985 revealed continuing South African communications and military support for RENAMO. FRELIMO, meanwhile, only partially honored commitments to expel various ANC members from its territory. Military stalemate. By the end of the 1980s, neither side was able to win the war by military means. The military pressure on RENAMO had not resulted in its defeat. While being incapable of capturing any large cities, it was still able to terrorize the rural areas. FRELIMO controlled the urban areas and the corridors, but was unable to protect the countryside from RENAMO squadrons. FRELIMO was also unable to pin down RENAMO and force it into a direct full-scale confrontation. On 19 October 1986, Mozambique's first president, Samora Machel, died when his presidential aircraft crashed near South Africa's border. Machel's successor was Joaquim Alberto Chissano, who had served as foreign minister from 1975 until Machel's death. Chissano continued Machel's policies of expanding Mozambique's international ties, particularly the country's links with the West, and pursuing internal reforms. During the war, hundreds of thousands of people died from famine. The famine was attributable to both the policies of RENAMO and FRELIMO.